Today I'm going to walk you through the basics of binding your mini quilt. So the things you're going to want are a 2-inch strip of fabric that is long enough to go around your quilt and then also have a little bit of excess. This is probably a little too much excess. It's just one I had on hand. Then you'll need your quilted mini quilt, a rotary cutter and or a pair of scissors, sewing machine that's threaded and has a bobbin that's full of thread, and possibly a couple of clips, and I'll show you why later. So when you hand quilt a quilt, one of the most important things when you're getting ready to do any kind of binding is to be very aware of where your knots are on the edges of your quilt. So this is a good example here. I don't want to cut too close to this edge. The typical, I should have mentioned, you also might want a quilting ruler in order to trim. The typical trimming method, especially when you're machine quilting, is to line up your ruler and then go ahead and just use the rotary cutter to trim. But in this case, I want to just be very aware of where I'm putting my ruler, and or it's also possible to just use the scissors. I don't see too many trouble areas here, so I am just going to line up my ruler, but I'm going to be very careful to make sure that it's on the outside edge of where that knot is lying. So I'll just line that up, take my rotary cutter, and very carefully cut along both edges. I don't have to worry about the top so much because there's no quilting, there's no ends of the quilting on the top. So I'll do the same thing on the other side. Just line it up here with the edge of the quilt. And here I do again see a little knot there. So I'm just going to pull it out away from that knot, lining it up at the bottom so that it's nice and flush and square, but making sure that my ruler is coming on the outside of that knot. And in this case, I'm going to come around, do that one more time, lining it up on the bottom and then squaring it up like that. So you have a little, in this case, have a little excess batting on the edge here. Because I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam to sew my binding on, that batting is not going to be a problem, that little extra. So the next step is to take your binding fabric and you're going to place it with the right side facing your quilt on the front of the quilt. So what I'm going to do here, I'm not going to start sewing right at this edge. I'm going to leave, I would say at least 2, but maybe 3 inches just to be generous. And then I will take this to my sewing machine and start sewing right about here and sew all the way to the edge here. So I'm going to pause myself. When I get to this edge, what I'm going to do is stop approximately 1/4 inch, or for me, it's like just a little bit less than my finger width from the edge, this corner. And I'll show you what I'm going to do next. So once I get there, I might rotate once or twice just to get a little bit closer to that spot that I want, that 1/4 inch. I'm putting down, I'm using my rotator on the right here to lower my needle down, and I'm going to lift my presser foot and turn the quilt so that I have that little tip of the corner there right at the very edge. So I'm going to be sewing a sort of diagonal line to the edge of that fabric, of the quilt rather. So I lowered my presser foot and now I'll just sew all the way off that edge. Lift my presser foot and I'll snip my thread. So now you can see here, and it's actually not perfect. I may go back and redo that. But what I want to do is sew all the way to that 1/4 inch and then run off the edge of the quilt right at that very, very tip, that very corner. Okay, so I did go ahead and seam rip and re-sew that just so that I could get it just how I wanted, so that that seam runs right to that little corner. So here is the part that could be a little tricky. What you want to do is take your binding fabric, fold it, so you're folding it with, like imagine you're folding it in half like that. But you're going to take the folded fabric and sort of press it over here to the left, and you'll have a sort of flap where that is. And then I take my fingers and just sort of press that down, line this up with the edge, and when I start sewing again, I'm not going to start from the very, very tip. I sew like maybe about 3/8 of an inch off that edge, again, using a 1/4 inch seam. And that just sort of locks this in so that I'm able to fold it out later. So let's see if I can get this back here. Just about, a little bit off that edge. And then I'm going to sew the next seam. And I'm using my 1/4 inch foot, but however you are able to roughly sew a 1/4 inch seam using your sewing machine, that will work. So I'm again coming to this edge, so I'm going to stop, put the needle down, and I think I hit it a lot better that time. So now I'm coming off the edge again. And so you repeat that, and I'll take you all the way to the very last corner. Okay, so now I'm ready to sew this final edge. I'm doing the same thing I did with the other 3 corners, but what I want to do is leave a little bit of space here so that I have room to connect these 2 pieces together. So I'm going to say about 1 inch here, just to make sure that this edge is stable before I start showing you the process for connecting them. Okay, so that's probably good right there. So I'm actually going to take this off, even though that seam is not finished. I am clipping my threads there, and I have quite an excess here. So I'm actually just going to take my scissors and cut that so that it's not quite so excessive. Okay, and I'm actually going to move over to show you how to do this next part. All right, so there's several methods for doing this. The simplest and most straightforward would be to just connect these with a straight seam. Most quilters will probably recommend, though, to try to do this connection on the bias, which just means running on the bias of the actual fabric, because it's more durable, and it's just generally, I've heard it recommended for keeping, having a long life of your quilt. Now, this is a small art quilt, so ultimately, if I wanted to keep it simple and just, measure and cut and sew that seam there, it really would be fine. But I'm just gonna, in the interest of showing you a method that also does have a little bit of a cleaner finish, I'll just show you this one. So what I like to do is line my fabric up and pretend like I'm showing my fabric where I want it to meet. So I want my fabric to meet right about here. So I'm trying to get these angles as clean as I can. And I just tend to finger press that, just kind of give myself a little bit of a crease. And once I've done that, I will take this back to my sewing machine, and you can see here, there's like a pretty obvious crease. But another supply that I find really useful are markers. This is an erasable pen. So what I'll sometimes do is just place tiny little marks, and it's not erasable, it's air erasable rather. So this will disappear. It actually disappears pretty quickly, so I need to move quickly. So what I want to do is match these 2 folds right sides together, because once I do that, I will be able to sew that seam and clip the edges and continue making the binding. So don't be afraid to fold your quilt up in order to do this. And I will also tend to, so I put the marks here on the right side of the fabric, and then the one that I'm folding over, I put the marks on the wrong side of the fabric, just where I put that little fold. So that just gives me a little bit of a guide. So I will fold this, and what I'm attempting to do is match those little marks. I do not generally tend to use pins when I'm quilting. I'm more of a just fly by the seat of my fingers and just kind of I tend to hold the fabric with my fingers a lot. If you are a pinner, this would probably be a great time to sort of pin these right in place so you'll get them just where you want them. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to hold this with one hand and move the camera back over and just show you sewing this next seam. Okay, so I have got my lined up seams and I did change my presser foot here as well. This thing wants to zoom out of focus. To be able to sew along here without my little 1/4 inch foot getting in the way. So I'm going to put my presser foot down, and I might actually slow my speed just a hair to make sure that I can really gently hold these in place while I sew that. And I kind of double check as I'm going and kind of gently shift things around just to make sure I'm getting it as close to that fold line as possible. So I don't know if I was just lucky, but it actually did turn out pretty well. These are matched up, and it feels, sometimes what will happen is there'll just be a big gap here because I have not taken enough care to really line that seam up. But in this case, it's looking pretty good. So what I like to do is cut off the excess and try to leave about a 1/4 inch seam allowance there, just because that keeps it from getting too unstable. And then I'll just finger press. I think I left more like 5/8 of an inch there. That's okay. I'll just finger press this, and because I attach those together, you'll see now I have this little bit of a seam left to sew to finish that part of the binding. So I like to start maybe just a couple of stitches back, and I'll go over what I've already done just to kind of reinforce it just a little bit, and I line it up just so. And I'll also go a couple stitches past. I don't tend to do a ton of back stitching, which is sort of a an accepted standard that most people do. So what I'll tend to do is overcompensate by stitching over what I've already done just to make sure that it's nice and secure. Okay, and that is it. The binding is now attached to your mini quilt. Okay, so this is where the magic happens. So what I'm going to do now is basically open up this binding that we've put all around the quilt and fold it over towards the back all the way around. And the next step is to flip it to the back, and I'm going to just take the right side of the binding, fold it over once, and fold it over again. So I get a nice, tight, clean edge. And this is where those clips can come in handy. Pins can work here too. But what I'll do is just, when I come to the corner, I want a nice, crisp, clean corner. So what I tend to do is I fold one edge over, which again, that procedure is you have it open, fold it, and fold it again. And so this corner, it really wants to lay just right. I just kind of talk to it. So what I'll do is pull one side out, still fold it over, and you'll get this really nice crisp triangle there. So once you've got that crisp triangle, fold it back, and most of the time I find that it just really is happy to line up right the way you want it. And it might be kind of hard to see because it's pink on pink. But what I'm trying to do is line it up so that it gives that nice, crisp, mitered corner. And so then I'll put my clip like so. And I'm going to do that all the way around the edges. And then I'll give you a final option here. I realize I need a few more clips. A final option here for how to finish your binding. Okay, so you've got everything all neatly ready, and you can see one of my favorite parts is turning it over and just seeing how lovely and crisp it looks on the front. But back to the back. So there are different ways that you can finish this binding. One is to machine sew a line all the way around. And that is a very good option. However, it will show on the front. Looks like I have a little thread here to cut. That would have been, there we go. It will show on the front, which for me, a quilt this size and shape, it's just, I personally don't want to see a line of machine quilting. A machine stitching rather. I really want to highlight the hand quilting. So my typical go-to is what I will do is just sew a seam all the way around to enclose the binding on the back using what's called a blind stitch. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate for you today because that's my preferred method. So I will just show you how that works. Okay, so I am choosing to just use a simple 50 weight thread, and it's kind of a cream thread that will likely just blend in. There are times that I actually choose to use the big stitch binding method. In this case, I think I'm preferring something a little simpler, but that's another option that I didn't mention, which you can basically just use the same method that you use to quilt the front of the quilt, but quilt, or rather stitch, all the way around the edge with the big stitches. And that can be a really cool look if that's what you want. So to do the blind stitch, I just come up through the back, and I did not have a thick enough knot for that. So we're going to go ahead and double that up. We're going to do four rounds, see if that'll help. Okay, let's try again. All right, coming up through the back gently. Okay, it worked that time. So what I do here, and I'm just tucking that thread under, is I take a tiny little bite out of the fabric of the backing, and I come back out maybe about 5/8 of an inch to my left and pull my thread all the way through. And there is a little bit of a stitch there, but generally what you'll see once we really get started with this is the stitches basically disappear. They're very hard to see. I mean, I'm going to show you them because I want you to see what they look like. But once it's done, especially if you were to use a coordinating thread, they're basically invisible. So I'm going to show you that again. I take a tiny bite. I'm just going through the backing. I'm not going through the batting or the front of the quilt. And I come out about 5/8 of an inch to the left, pull through, and capture some odd piece of thread. I think that's a piece of thread from the backing. And start again. Now I'm holding my left my left pointer finger right under where my needle is going through. So I'm going to be able to give myself a clue if I am pinching too far and getting into the actual quilt here. If I did that, I have done that many times, there's such small stitches that really ultimately it probably doesn't matter. But ideally, what I like to do is keep these blind stitches on the back. And so I tend to do a couple at a time, usually 2 at a time, because that just saves me pulling the thread through. And I'm coming here to an edge and I'm noticing my little mitered corner is not looking super mitered. So what I'll do if that happens is pull it out again. Often it's like what I'm seeing here is this fold is too thick for what I want it to be. So I just take the fabric and very, very gently roll it with my fingers so that it's right back where I want it to be, so that it'll be even with the other side, and do that same method of kind of folding and gently rolling this up, and that looks a lot better. That's really more what I'm going for. All right, so I'll just go ahead and finish this stitching and show you how it looks when it's done. I should also say here, some people will stitch all the way out to the corner here. For the purposes of a small art quilt like this, I personally don't worry about that. I basically just sew a line all the way around the actual edge of this hem. But if you were binding a quilt that you were going to be washing and using, I would recommend maybe doing a couple blind stitches or even a decorative stitch out there to the edge, just to make sure that that doesn't flap up. Okay, so I have stitched all the way around every edge and it's all secured down. The last thing I want to do, and this is very similar to what you'll do when you're hand quilting, is tie a knot or two here and then bury this thread. So I typically, with thread this thin, I like to do at least two and try to match them up, 2 knots. And then I just find an inconspicuous place to just very gently insert my needle, pull it through until I feel that knot pop and I can hear it pop, and then give it a snip. So that is how I bind my little art quilts. This, I should say, is the single fold binding technique, and I just love doing it this way. It can be, a lot of quilters will use the double fold technique, and so what they'll do is they'll actually pre-press their strip so that when they attach it onto the front, it's already folded, and then when you fold it around, you get that double fold. So it's a little bit more secure and a little bit more strong, I guess, for quilting. But I personally just love doing it this way, and it works for me. So there you have it, a little bound mini quilt.